Just 2 minutes ago, whispers from inside the palace revealed an order so sensitive it was never meant to leave closed doors. A directive that quietly redefined royal visibility, future planning, and hierarchy. At the center of it all, Princess Charlotte. According to insiders, the order would have shifted her role dramatically. But before it could be enforced, Catherine stepped in and stopped it cold. The question is no longer what happened, but why it nearly did. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. What followed that initial shock was not confusion, but recognition. Palace veterans reportedly understood immediately that this was not a routine adjustment or a temporary scheduling change. The language, though restrained, carried weight words, chosen to alter how presence is granted, how futures are paced, and how importance is signaled without ever saying it aloud. Issued quietly, the order avoided the usual channels, bypassing ceremonial acknowledgement and formal announcement, suggesting urgency and sensitivity rather than consensus. Early signs pointed directly toward Princess Charlotte, not by name, but by implication subtle recalibrations in exposure, appearances, and long-term planning that would have reclassified her visibility at a formative moment. Senior aides, sources say, felt the tension instantly. Meetings shortened. Conversations hushed. Eyes flicked toward doors. The atmosphere shifted from procedure to consequence, because everyone knew that once an order like this takes effect, reversal becomes reputationally costly. What made the intervention so unexpected was not Catherine's concern protectiveness has always been assumed, but the speed and decisiveness with which she acted. There was no slow escalation, no trial balloon, no allowance for the directive to settle. She reportedly identified the downstream effect immediately, that a quiet sidelining, once normalized, would become precedent, and precedent would become destiny. Insiders suggest the move cut against an unspoken current inside the palace, a belief that visibility must be tightly managed early to avoid complications later. Catherine's response fractured that assumption, reframing caution as erasure and management as diminishment. The shock was compounded by the realization that this was not an isolated incident. The order appeared to be part of a broader, incremental strategy, small adjustments stacking into permanent outcomes, none dramatic alone, all decisive together. In stopping it, Catherine didn't merely halt a document. She interrupted a trajectory. The emotional undertone was unmistakable. Relief among some, alarm among others, and a sudden awareness that lines had been crossed without debate. Foreshadowing rippled through the corridors. If this could happen now, what else might already be in motion? The silence that followed only intensified the stakes. Because silence in the palace is rarely absence, it is containment. And containment signals that something larger has been exposed, something powerful enough to demand immediate control before it reshapes the narrative entirely. To understand why this order was so dangerous, we must first understand what Princess Charlotte represents inside the monarchy. Princess Charlotte has always occupied a delicate position, visible, beloved and powerful in symbolism, yet constrained by tradition. Insiders say that balance was beginning to shift, and not in her favor. From the moment she stepped into public view, Charlotte carried a resonance that went beyond rank, one that unsettled older assumptions about how young royal women should be seen. Her presence drew attention effortlessly, not because it was orchestrated, but because it felt natural. That popularity, sources say, became a quiet point of concern behind palace walls. In an institution built on order and predictability, spontaneous affection can be destabilizing. Charlotte's unique position within the line of succession placed her at an intersection the monarchy has historically struggled to manage, important enough to matter, but not positioned to lead. That liminal space has often been where royal daughters are carefully softened, their roles narrowed to prevent complications later. Insiders point to a long pattern where public warmth toward royal girls triggers internal recalibration, not celebration. The reasoning, they say, is never framed as punishment, but as protection from scrutiny, from expectation, from becoming too much too soon. Yet protection, when prolonged, becomes limitation. Early signals allegedly began to surface in subtle ways: fewer forward-facing moments, quieter planning language, an emphasis on formality over presence. None of it dramatic, all of it cumulative. The historical treatment of royal daughters versus sons loomed large in these choices. Sons are prepared for trajectory, daughters are prepared for containment. Charlotte's risk, insiders warn, was becoming ceremonial, too early praised for charm, while being gently removed from meaningful visibility. That transition, once set, is difficult to reverse, because it reshapes public perception at a formative stage. The emotional weight of that possibility reverberated among those closest to her. Sources describe a growing unease, a sense that the institution was defaulting to instinct rather than intention. Charlotte's popularity, rather than being leveraged thoughtfully, was being managed downward, smoothed into something safer. The foreshadowing was unmistakable. A quiet internal divide between those who saw her as an asset to be nurtured and those who saw her as a variable to be controlled. This tension mirrored older conflicts within the monarchy, where visibility is currency and unpredictability is risk. Charlotte, by simply being herself, challenged that calculus. The shift insiders observed was not abrupt but directional, a slow lean towards sidelining under the guise of balance. It was this trajectory, not a single moment, that set alarms ringing. Because once a role is redefined early, it shapes every expectation that follows. And that brings us to the order itself and what it was allegedly designed to change. The language of the order was subtle, bureaucratic, almost harmless on paper. But insiders say its implications were anything but. Those who saw the draft describe it as a masterclass in administrative restraint, the kind of document that never raises alarms unless you know exactly what to look for. There were no dramatic declarations, no explicit demotions, no mention of Princess Charlotte by name. Instead, the order quietly reframed future visibility and duties through phrasing that sounded procedural, even routine. Words like streamlining, prioritization, and long-term alignment appeared where more direct language once stood. To the untrained eye, it looked like planning. To those familiar with palace mechanics, it looked like recalibration. By avoiding Charlotte's name directly, the order insulated itself from immediate challenge. It targeted categories, not individuals, creating plausible deniability while reshaping outcomes. This is where the power of administrative language becomes dangerous in royal planning. Authority is rarely removed outright. It is diluted, deferred, and quietly reassigned. Insiders say the order shifted emphasis toward future roles that favored predictability over presence, hierarchy over resonance. In practice, that would have meant fewer opportunities, reduced visibility, and a narrowing of scope at a stage when impressions harden permanently. Sources allege the directive had backing from figures who view popularity as something to be controlled, not encouraged, particularly when it threatens to complicate long-term narratives. The support was not unanimous, but it was strategic, rooted in a belief that early containment prevents later disruption. Timing made it especially alarming. This was not a distant plan for adulthood. It intersected with a formative window when public identity begins to crystallize. Insiders say that raised immediate red flags among aides who understood how quickly temporary adjustments become permanent precedent. Early warnings were reportedly raised behind the scenes, quiet objections framed as logistical concerns rather than moral ones. That alone speaks volumes about the climate. When resistance must disguise itself as process feedback, fear is already at work. The tension intensified as the implications became clearer. What looked neutral was directional. What sounded cautious was corrective. The order did not erase Charlotte from the future, but it nudged her toward the margins, where roles are ceremonial and influence is symbolic. That distinction matters. Symbolism without substance is easy to praise, and easy to ignore. Insiders describe a growing sense that something irreversible was being set in motion under the cover of routine governance. The most unsettling part, they say, was how calmly it was received by those who saw it as necessary. That calm suggested precedent, not exception. It suggested this was how uncomfortable adjustments are made quietly, legally, and without spectacle. Yet no one expected the strongest resistance to come from Catherine herself. Catherine has never been impulsive. When she acts, it is measured and final. Sources say this moment pushed her past quiet concern into decisive action. Those who know her describe a reputation built on strategic patience, a long view honed by years of observing how power truly moves inside the palace. She listens longer than most. She waits while others rush. But patience, insiders say, does not mean passivity. It means choosing the moment when intervention cannot be dismissed. That moment arrived, according to sources, when Catherine allegedly learned the full scope of the order, not the sanitized summary, but the downstream consequences hidden in its structure. What unsettled her wasn't merely the reduction of future visibility, it was the logic behind it. A logic that treated her daughter as a variable to be managed, rather than a person to be protected. For Catherine, this crossed a line that was both personal and institutional. As a parent, it threatened a child's sense of place. As a future queen, it undermined a principle she believes the monarchy must uphold: continuity through fairness, not containment through caution. Insiders say Catherine understood immediately what this kind of recalibration does over time. It narrows options. It hardens perceptions. It quietly tells a story that becomes difficult to reverse. Her role in that instant shifted from observer to protector, not just of Charlotte, but of the framework that determines how young royals are shaped before they can speak for themselves. Those close to the situation insist she did not storm offices or demand public reversals. That is not her way. Instead, she challenged the order without spectacle, applying pressure where it matters most through precedent, through quiet alliances, through questions that expose weakness without raising voices. She reportedly asked why such measures were necessary now, who benefited from them, and what unintended consequences they would set in motion. Each question, sources say, was surgical. Each answer revealed cracks. The more she pressed, the clearer it became that the order relied on silence to survive. And Catherine does not confuse silence with consent. Her defiance, insiders claim, was calm but unmistakable. She did not frame it as rebellion, she framed it as responsibility. That distinction matters inside palace walls. Responsibility carries weight. Rebellion invites dismissal. By positioning her challenge as stewardship of the institution's future, she made it harder to ignore and impossible to rush past. Those involved sensed the shift immediately. The balance changed. What was once an administrative inevitability became a reputational risk. And with that shift came consequences: strained relationships, recalculated strategies, and an unspoken recognition that Catherine had drawn a boundary. Not loudly, not theatrically, but firmly enough that crossing it would leave marks. The defiance signaled something larger than a single decision. It suggested a new phase, one where protection is proactive and authority is exercised before damage is done. But Catherine wasn't acting on instinct alone, she was acting on history. The monarchy has a long memory. And Catherine, insiders say, knows exactly how young royal women have been sidelined before. She knows because history inside the palace is not taught in textbooks, it's absorbed through patterns, omissions and quiet rewrites that happen over decades. Time and again, daughters have been celebrated briefly, then carefully folded into the background once their visibility became inconvenient. Labelled as protected, positioned as secondary, gradually reduced until their presence felt ceremonial rather than consequential. According to those close to Catherine, this awareness shaped her reaction more than any single document ever could. She reportedly understood the danger of early role reduction, not as an isolated administrative choice, but as the first step in a long institutional narrowing. Once a young royal's scope is quietly limited, it becomes easy to justify further exclusions later. Less visibility here, fewer responsibilities there, all framed as sensible restraint. But restraint, Catherine has learned, often disguises erasure. Insiders claim she has studied the lessons left behind by predecessors who were told they were being shielded, only to discover years later that protection had cost them influence, voice, and relevance. History inside the monarchy is filled with women whose paths were decided before they were old enough to question them, whose futures were edited in the name of stability. Catherine, sources say, recognized the familiar language immediately. She saw how easily concern could harden into containment, how quickly safeguarding could slide into sidelining. That recognition carried weight because it wasn't theoretical, it was institutional memory resurfacing. She allegedly understood that once a narrative is set early, it becomes difficult to challenge without appearing disruptive, and the monarchy, by design, resists disruption. This is why her response was shaped not by emotion alone, but by precedent. She knew that allowing the order to stand would not simply affect Princess Charlotte's immediate visibility, it would establish a framework that could follow her for life. Catherine is said to have viewed the situation through the long lens how history would interpret silence, how future justifications would reference this moment as already decided. That realization created discomfort inside the palace, because it forced a confrontation with patterns many would prefer remain unspoken. Insiders describe a sudden unease as Catherine's perspective reframed the issue from logistics to legacy. What had been presented as procedural now looked ideological. What had been called protection now resembled preemptive limitation. And once history enters the conversation, deflection becomes harder. The palace, sources say, felt that discomfort immediately. Long-standing assumptions were questioned. Old rationales sounded thinner when placed against past outcomes. Catherine's response did not accuse, but it implied something more unsettling, that the institution might be repeating mistakes it never fully acknowledged. That implication alone was enough to shift the atmosphere. Because when history is invoked, accountability follows. And with accountability comes resistance. Once Catherine moved, the palace had to respond, and fast. According to sources, the moment Catherine intervened, internal balance shifted, meetings were called, language was revised, and silence became policy. What had been moving quietly through channels suddenly froze mid-motion, as if the palace itself sensed the ground giving way. Insiders describe emergency discussions erupting across senior levels, not scheduled, not ceremonial, but reactive people summoned with little notice, briefed in fragments, asked to recalibrate positions they had assumed were settled. The directive was not withdrawn, sources insist, it was paused, deliberately left in limbo, as though time itself could soften its impact. That choice alone signaled fear. Fear of exposure. Fear of misinterpretation. Fear that public scrutiny, once ignited, would not be containable. Within those closed rooms, language reportedly became the battlefield. Words were dissected, softened, restructured. Phrases once considered neutral were suddenly deemed combustible. The goal was not clarity, it was containment. Advisors are said to have warned that any announcement, even a denial, could validate rumors already forming beyond palace walls. And so silence became the strategy. Not because there was nothing to say, but because too much had already been implied. Attempts were made to manage the situation quietly, conversations redirected, schedules adjusted, internal guidance reframed as routine. Yet that very quiet intensified the chaos. Without an official explanation, uncertainty filled the vacuum. Staff members reportedly questioned what they were allowed to reference, what they were meant to forget, and what might resurface later as evidence of intent. The absence of a statement was itself a statement, one that fueled speculation rather than extinguishing it. According to insiders, there was also an acute awareness of timing. Any leak now would land differently, interpreted through the lens of Catherine's intervention, framed as a power struggle rather than procedure. That risk prompted further restraint, further delay, further recalibration. But the cost of delay was internal strain. Lines of authority blurred. Confidence in prior assumptions weakened. People who believed the order reflected consensus began to wonder whether consensus had ever existed at all. In this atmosphere, silence functioned as both shield and confession. It protected the institution from immediate backlash, while quietly acknowledging that something had gone wrong. And beneath it all ran a current of unease. If one intervention could halt a directive so completely, what did that say about the fragility of the system that produced it? Sources say this question lingered in every meeting, unspoken but felt. Because pausing the order did not resolve the underlying tension, it exposed it. It revealed how quickly stability could be disrupted, how swiftly a single act of resistance could unravel carefully arranged plans. The palace may have contained the moment, but it could not erase the impression it left behind. The machinery resumed, slower now, more cautious, aware that its movements were being watched from within as much as from without. But stopping the order was only the beginning. The real impact was what it revealed. By halting the order, Catherine may have altered more than a schedule. She may have changed her daughter's trajectory. What insiders describe is not a simple pause, but a pivot that forces the palace to rethink how Princess Charlotte's future is mapped, measured, and managed. Plans that once seemed quietly predetermined are now under scrutiny, not because they were publicly challenged, but because they were privately exposed. Charlotte's role, long balanced between visibility and protection, has reportedly entered a new phase 1, where every appearance, every omission, every decision carries added weight. Sources suggest that after the intervention, discussions around her future became more cautious, more layered, and paradoxically, more intense. The assumption that her path could be gradually narrowed without consequence has been shaken. Instead, there is now an awareness that limiting visibility too early can shape identity, confidence, and perception in ways that cannot be undone. For Charlotte herself, the emotional stakes are said to be significant, even if she remains shielded from the details. Those closest to her reportedly worry not just about public expectations, but about the quieter pressures of knowing one's place is being actively negotiated. Catherine's move reframed that concern into something sharper, a determination that her daughter's upbringing would not be defined by premature erasure disguised as protection. Insiders hint that this moment could influence how Charlotte is prepared for life within the institution, less as a background figure, more as a presence whose value is acknowledged rather than managed away. Yet with that comes increased scrutiny. Every step forward invites observation, comparison, and judgment. The balance Catherine now faces is delicate, ensuring Charlotte is seen enough to matter, but not so exposed that she becomes a symbol rather than a child. That balance, sources say, will define the coming years. It will shape how Charlotte understands duty, how she experiences family, and how she learns to navigate an environment where intentions are rarely singular. This intervention has also introduced a subtle tension into future planning, as advisors weigh caution against consequence. The idea that a daughter's role can be minimized without cost no longer holds the same authority. Instead, there is a growing recognition that such decisions reverberate across generations, influencing not just optics but character. Catherine's action is now viewed by some as a line drawn early, a signal that Charlotte's development will be guided as deliberately as her brother's, albeit in different ways. That resolve, however, foreshadows challenges ahead. As Charlotte grows, expectations will collide with boundaries, and protection will clash with purpose. The path forward is no longer quiet or assumed. It is contested, watched, and emotionally charged. And in that charged space, the monarchy must confront a truth it often avoids. Shaping the future of its youngest members is not a neutral act, but a defining one. And with Charlotte's future reconsidered, the monarchy itself faces a quiet reckoning. This wasn't just about one child, it was about who decides the future of the next generation. Beneath the surface of this intervention lies a strategic struggle that has been building quietly for years, a tension between inherited tradition and an evolving sense of modern authority. Insiders describe a palace increasingly divided between those who believe the old mechanisms should continue to shape young royals without question, and those who see that approach as dangerously outdated. Catherine's role in halting the order is now viewed as more than maternal instinct. It is seen as a signal of growing institutional influence. She is no longer merely adapting to the system, she is shaping it. That shift has unsettled long-standing assumptions about who holds real power behind the scenes, particularly when it comes to the next generation. The dynamic inside the palace is said to have subtly recalibrated, with some figures gaining quiet leverage while others retreat into silence. For supporters of the order, this moment represented a loss of control, a reminder that decisions once made in private corridors can now be challenged before they harden into policy. For others, it marked a necessary correction, proof that the future of the monarchy cannot be engineered through quiet reduction and procedural maneuvering alone. What makes this moment resonate beyond Charlotte is the precedent it sets. If one directive can be stopped, questioned, and effectively neutralized, then others may follow. The idea that young royals can be guided invisibly, their paths narrowed without debate, has been disrupted. That disruption creates silent winners and losers, those who benefit from transparency, and those whose influence depended on opacity. Sources suggest that this recalibration has already changed how future decisions are discussed, with more caution, more consultation, and more awareness that resistance is possible. Yet this also introduces risk. Power shifts rarely occur without consequence, and the palace is an institution that remembers defiance. Catherine's growing authority, while respected by some, is quietly resented by others who see it as an erosion of established hierarchy. The contrast is stark, a modern vision focused on agency and protection versus a traditional model rooted in control and predictability. This clash does not end with one halted order, it lingers, reshaping conversations about upbringing, visibility, and legacy. The most ominous implication is that this struggle is far from resolved. By intervening, Catherine has stepped into a space that was never meant to be publicly contested, and that space is now charged with expectation. Decisions once made silently will now be watched, interpreted, and remembered. The future of the next generation has become a question of authority as much as affection, of governance as much as guardianship. And as the palace absorbs the shock of this shift, one reality becomes unavoidable. The rules that once governed succession, influence, and preparation are being quietly rewritten. Which brings us to the final and most unsettling question of all. 2 minutes ago, a palace order was stopped, but the ripple it created may last for decades. What appeared, on the surface, to be a single corrective act has already begun to expose the deeper architecture of royal governance, the quiet mechanisms that shape futures long before the public ever notices. Inside the institution, this moment is being discussed not as a disruption, but as a revelation. It has forced an uncomfortable recognition that authority is no longer exercised solely through tradition, but through intent. Catherine's intervention did more than protect one child. It asserted a vision for the next era, one in which the shaping of young royals is not left to procedural drift or inherited assumptions. That shift carries weight. It redefines who gets to architect the future and how openly those decisions must now be defended. For Princess Charlotte, the implications are double-edged. Her position is now more protected than it was moments before the order surfaced, yet it is also more closely watched. Protection invites scrutiny. Safeguards invite challenge. Insiders suggest that every decision involving her visibility, education, and public role will now be passed for meaning, measured against this intervention as a benchmark. The cost of stepping in, then, is not abstract. It is personal and political. Catherine has accepted the burden of being seen as a gatekeeper, a role that invites resistance from those who preferred the comfort of quiet consensus. Success, in this case, came with consequence. The victory is real, but so is the tension it leaves behind. This episode also reveals something more unsettling about the modern monarchy, how much of it operates in the unseen space between policy and perception. Orders can be drafted without announcement. Futures can be nudged without debate. And unless someone intervenes at precisely the right moment, those decisions harden into reality without ever facing daylight. That reality reframes the institution itself not as a static relic, but as a living system where power moves quietly, and where silence can be as decisive as decree. The contrast is stark. On one side, the promise of stability and continuity. On the other, the risk of erasure through administrative drift. Charlotte's near sidelining becomes a symbol of that tension, a reminder that even the most visible royals are vulnerable to invisible processes. What lingers now is not relief, but vigilance. The palace may have contained the immediate fallout, but the reckoning has only begun. Questions about governance, transparency, and intent will not fade easily. They will follow every closed-door meeting, every carefully worded directive, every absence of explanation. Because if one quiet decision could nearly sideline a future royal, what else is being decided behind closed doors right now? Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.